that. I want to start by introducing to you my beautiful mom, Jimmy Lloyd. And I don't need that chair either, Jackie. Yeah, the one time. If we can show it, we got a picture of her. That is my mama. And yes, that little boy, that is me. You can see the looks have lasted. And at the bottom, you can see my sisters with my mom and myself, Angie and Christy. And obviously, I am the one that got the looks in the family. I'm just saying what y'all were thinking. Now, yes, I know my mom is a beautiful woman. I know that because I was reminded several times throughout middle school and high school, because when she would come and pick me up or come into the classroom, the guys, my friends, would say, "Dude, your mom's so hot." And I would say, "Shut up." And there would be times that my mom would come. They didn't know it was my mom. They're like, "Oh, dude, did you see that hot woman that's over there?" And I'm like, "Dude, that is my mom." In fact, there was one time where this one friend of mine at school said, "Hey, man, you think I got a shot with your mom?" Whoa. And I said, "No, for two reasons. One, you're 12. Two, she's married to my dad." But yes, I did. I always thought my mom was a pretty lady, but I did not like to hear my friends say, "Dude, your mom's hot." Now, I don't remember the day or the month, but I remember the year. It was in 2000 that my mom and my dad asked me to meet them at Dunkin' Donuts on Midway Road and 25th Street. The Dunkin' Donuts is still there. Wasn't really sure why, but I went there, and my mom told me that she had been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. Now, I will admit that it did not sink in because I just thought, well, my mom's going to beat it. It's not a big deal. I never really had a whole lot of death in my family. I had my best friend died when I was 16, but on both sides of my family, all four of my grandparents were still alive, and it just wasn't something that didn't sink in, and I just thought, she's going to be okay. She's going to beat this. From that moment, in the year 2000, it led to 5 years of my mom fighting cancer. And through those 5 years, it was like a roller coaster ride because she would have chemotherapy, radiation. They would say, "She's cancer-free," and we would celebrate. And then a few months later, they'd come back and say, "Oh, we found cancer. It popped up somewhere else." There's different times it would pop up in different places. Time where she had it had a tumor in her brain and had surgery to remove that, and they said after that she's cancer-free, and we celebrated. There were times where we had preachers and evangelists and prophets and people that would have dreams of my mom holding her grandkids, and they said, "God has told us your mom is going to beat this. She is going to be healed." And we said yes. And then on August 25th of 2004, at the Port St. Lucie Hospital, my mom breathed her last breath. And I'll never forget this because I went to Walgreens to pick up some stuff, and I was talking to my friend in Michigan, and his dad passed away a year before my mom did, and he said, "Jimmy, when you get back to that hospital, your mom," and my mom, she was on morphine, she was taking deep breaths, she was not really there, but he said, before she breathed her last breath, if there is anything that you would ever thought that you would want to tell your mom, rush back to the hospital and tell her. I got back, and for 30 minutes, as my sisters and my dad was sleeping in the room, I bent down at my mom's bed, and I began to tell her everything I could think of that I would ever want to tell her. And for 30 minutes, I would tell her, "Mom, I'm sorry I did this when I was a teenager. Or, Mom, I'm sorry about this. Mom, I'm sorry about the time when you wanted me to stay a little longer on Christmas, but I wanted to go see that movie. And I would just said all this stuff. And then when I got done, I stood up. And I looked at my mom, and she took one deep breath. And with that breath, she was gone. And I woke up my dad, and we went and got the nurse. And at that moment, I will admit that the feeling that I had was relief, because now my mom is no longer in pain. But it took a while to set in that my mom is actually gone. And me and my sisters, and my dad, we had questions, We had preachers and evangelists and prophets, and people have dreams, and said that she would live. And so we asked them, we went to them and said, you said she would live. And we were told, well, your mom she didn't have enough faith. And we responded, there ain't no way. She had so much faith until her last breath. She believed she would be healed. There's no way. And we were told, well, that's what she says, but that might not have been what she believed. We're told by somebody else that, well, maybe she had faith, but somebody in your family may not have had faith. And then it was, well, was it me? Was it my sisters? Was it my dad? Was it? And over again, it was because of this and because of that. And I just want to say this, by the way. If God says He is going to do something, He's going to do it. And it would have been so much better. And I promise you that I will do this. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And I know Pastor Mark, and I know, hey, there may be times where I missed it. And if they would have said that. But over the next few years, built up this resentment. This thing that I can't really, I try to think of another word to say, but I can't. This hatred. I remember at my mom's funeral, people coming to that funeral, I remember I was just so much resentment built up. And I remember people walking through the door, and I thought, they should not be here. Because I remember I overheard them talking about my mom. Do they not remember how they treated my mom? If it wasn't for my dad, there's one person I probably would have escorted out of there. And this unforgiveness set in. And this, God, why did you let my mom die? Which at that time, I didn't realize it wasn't God that took my mom. And we were told, well, it must have been her time. And we were told, don't question God. By the way, if anybody ever tells you don't question God, that's a pretty good sign that they never read the Bible, because the Bible is full of men and women of God, great men and women of God, who questioned God at times. I remember being told, well, you're going to see her one day. And that may be true, but one day does not help me right now when I need my mom. One day doesn't help me when I am going through a divorce the first time or the second time. One day doesn't help me when they're taking my house away and I need to talk to my mom. One day doesn't help me when they hook my truck up to a tow truck and pull it out of my driveway. One day doesn't help me. There was a time when at one moment I looked in my bank account and I had $300,000. A little bit later, I looked at my bank account. It was negative over $20,000. And you want to tell me about one day I needed to talk to my mom. And I was so mad. I remember saying, I will never step foot in a church again. And actually, for 14 years, I didn't step foot in the church that I grew up in because I was so mad. And it ate me up. And you want to talk about one day. One day. One day, well, I believe my mom's in heaven. The route I'm going right now, that one day, how about if I don't make it to heaven, then I'll never see my mom again. And you want to talk about one day? One day. And then, how about those people that looked me in the eye on the day of my mom's funeral and said, I will always be here for you. And then you see that person in Walmart and they see you coming and they walk the other way. What do you do with that? Hold that thought because we'll get back to that story. So, there's this time in history between Adam and Eve and the fall of man and Noah. And then again, between Noah, the great flood, and Abraham. You know, Father Abraham. Between those two periods of time, there was where men lost sight and was totally separated from our Creator. In fact, with Noah, there was only one man that God would declared righteous, and it was Noah. And then with Abraham, they had not heard from our Creator, from this God, for years until He spoke to Abraham. So, sometime between Adam and Eve and Noah and the flood and Father Abraham, there was this cave woman. And this cave woman, who obviously lived in a cave, came to the realization outside her cave there was this plant. And she grew very fond of this plant because this plant produced at times food that she would eat off of and her family would eat off of. Now, over a matter of time, this cave woman came aware of that this plant, that she depended upon this plant to survive. And then over a matter of time, she realized that this plant was dependent on other forces. Like, eventually she realized, she came to the awareness that there was this big ball of fire that would be in the sky, that would move across the sky throughout the day. And she realized that this plant would be dependent upon this ball of fire. If the ball of fire was too hot, it would scorch the plant and it would die. Then she came under the awareness that there was this water that from time to time would fall from the sky. Now, sometimes she could tell when it was going to fall, and other times it would fall unexpectedly. And she learned that this plant was not only dependent on this ball of fire, but was also dependent upon this rain, because if it didn't rain at all, it would dry up. But if it rained too much, it would wash this plant away. So this cave woman became under this awareness that she was dependent upon this plant. This plant was dependent upon these other forces that she had absolutely no control over. Now, this cave woman became aware of this other ball of light that would be in the night sky. And it would move across the sky, and from time to time it would become thinner and thinner and thinner until it was like a crescent shape. And then this cave woman became aware that, well, after every 30 balls of fire, this moon would repeat this cycle. And then this cave woman became aware that through this cycle, it started to affect her body in a certain way throughout this cycle. And as you can tell, I'm being very careful to articulate my words when talking about this cycle of this cave woman. Now, this cave woman had a cave husband. And this cave husband loved to hunt when he was not selling car insurance. And from time to time, the cave husband would go out with the other cave husbands, and he would go for a hunt, and sometimes he would be gone for a couple of hours and come back with a kill. But there was other times when he would be gone with the other cave husbands for days and come back exhausted with absolutely nothing. Now, this cave husband would get with the other cave husbands when he would get back from the hunt, and they would talk and tell stories. And when the cave husband would tell stories with the other cave husbands, the cave woman would eavesdrop. And when she eavesdropped, she would hear stories about the hunt. And the stories like, man, that animal came right up to us. It was so easy. But there was other times when they would describe it as, there was not an animal anywhere, or that animal was so fast. And they would even describe it sometimes as the spirit of the hunt. And this cave woman started to realize that there wasn't much difference between her relationship with the plant and the cave husband's relationship with the hunt, because they were both dependent on forces outside of their control. Now, when this cave woman and husband, at times at night, when this big ball of light would pass through the evening sky, if it was at a certain point or a certain place and the light shined off the water in just a certain way, it would make them feel in a way where they would feel like, we need to light some candles and a bottle of wine. And then they would start to feel a certain way, and this cave husband and cave woman would get a little closer and something would happen. But the cave husband realized that this only took place after they were married. Now, after this very special night of candles and wine, the cave woman realized that something has taken root inside of her, and it has now, over time, began to grow. And as it begins to grow, it gets to a point where her body can no longer contain what's growing inside of her. And she gives birth to this new creature, this new life form. Now, when it was first born, there was actually terror between the cave woman and the cave husband, because there would be a moment at times where they weren't sure if this being, this new life, was going to take breath. And there was times where the cave woman would sometimes put her lips to this new life form and breathe breath into her new baby, and then that breath would take root, and the baby would begin to cry in this new life. But there were also times where she would give birth and it didn't take root. This breath didn't happen, and her and her cave husband would hold this lifeless life form in their arms. And this cave woman came to the realization that whether it's the plant or the hunt or the ball of fire or the ball of light or new birth, that there were forces outside of what she can control. Just give it up for our cave woman and cave husband. Thank you. By the way, my daughter, Addison, it's her boyfriend, Troy, who knows for sure that only happens after they're married. Thank you, guys. Now, during this time of the cave woman and the cave husband, humans, people, we were far from God. And they would notice these forces, and they would know that they could not control these forces. They were out of their control. So they got together and they said, you know what? We need to make sure that these forces are on our side. We need to, in other words, we need to make sure this force is with us. So they came up with this idea that we would take part of our crops or part of our cattle, and we would not eat all of it, but we would put a portion aside for these forces that we could not control, and we would offer them up. And then they built what was called an altar. By the way, I asked it, you know when in the Bible the first altar was ever built? I personally, until this week, I would have said Cain and Abel. But they didn't build an altar. They sacrificed, but the first altar was ever built with Noah. And then there was now an altar built again until Abraham. But during those times, and even before Noah, these people that were far from God would construct these altars out of rock. And they would offer to these forces, trying to get these forces on their side. And over time, they would even name and put personalities to these forces. And I not for this message, just in my own time, I started looking up this stuff, and I found it pretty interesting that all these gods that they came up with, because over time we needed these forces. It hasn't rained for so long, so maybe these forces ran out of buckets of water. So now we need to get them on our side so they bring us more buckets of water. Or our cattle is diseased, and now these forces, they must be mad at us, so we need to get them on our side. So they personalized and named these gods. There was El, it was the father god. Sham, the sky god. Baal, or Baal, the lightning god. Yaham, the water god. Utu, the god of sun and justice. Marduk, the god of thunder. It's not Thor, it was Marduk. Then there was this ancient Greek god, Artemis. And there was the god of hunting and the god of protecting small animals. Tell me how that worked. Come here. Come on. Come get food, guys. Like, it's one or the other. I guess it's like, come on. Thank you, Kathy. The ancient Sumerians, they even had this god, the goddess of beer. The goddess's name was Nikasi. And you can look it up. I dare you. Look it up. There is worship songs they wrote thousands of years ago to the goddess of beer. They are serious about their parties. You know what I'm talking about, Roll? Shouldn't have sat in the front row. It's like the splash zone. So they came to this conclusion: we need to keep the forces on our side. We need their favor, and they would offer these things up. So hey, but there was a fundamental flaw with this altar system, because see, here's the thing: if these gods blessed you, and you sacrificed 2 goats, now your cattle has grown and you are blessed. Now, what do? Do you offer 2 goats again? Well, you want to show them that you are appreciative, so now you're going to offer more. But if you offer 2 goats, and now your whole flock is diseased. And, well, the 2 goats must not have been enough. And now I need to offer more. And it was this fundamental flaw that it was always more, and you never knew where you stood with these gods. Now, what do you do when you have sacrificed all your crops and you have sacrificed all your cattle and you now need to offer more because that didn't work and now it's been 12 months, 16 months, 18 months, 20 months, and still no rain? The prophets of Baal, they would cut themselves in a way of shedding their own blood to show the god Baal or Baal, you can say it either way, that they are serious, and they would harm themselves and shed their own blood to try to appease this god. There was the goddess Kabbalah. And the goddess Kabbalah, she was around 500 BC, and it was in Asia Minor. And this god was considered the mother goddess, or the many-breasted one. It's a family show today. And this goddess was eternally procreating on your behalf. So you get a paycheck? Kabbalah. Your crops grow? Thank Kabbalah. Your cattle prosper? Thank Kabbalah. You have lots of children? Kabbalah. Now, this is a female deity, so there's a challenge for if you were a man. And there is historic evidence that the ultimate sacrifice, if you were a man, to the goddess Kabbalah is to castrate yourself and offer it on the altar. If you are a man and you are squirming, absolutely natural reaction to this story. Asia Minor, known for their choirs. I'll sing the high part. The Hebrew Scriptures and Leviticus, it talks often about the god Molech. In Leviticus 18:21, it says, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am Lord." Don't sacrifice my kids to Molech. Got it? Done. Next. But during that time, they were worshiping Molech, and this god required your firstborn. And what they would do is they would take their firstborn and they would wrap him or her in a burial cloth, which would end up suffocating the child. And then they would take this child in one of their rituals and they would put this child in the fire. Actually, and there's a lot of the kings of Judah would go to this place called the Valley of Hinnom, and they would go and sacrifice their children to Molech. In fact, they have dug up in the Valley of Hinnom, which is in the southwest corner of Jerusalem, they have dug up children's remains. You can go online and you can look at it. And why? Because, see, if you've offered your cattle and you've offered your crops and you have changed your body and it still requires more, well, how am I going to give him more? By giving this God what is the most valuable to me. Now, if you are going on vacation, Pastor Rocky, and you are stuck in a hotel room and you sit down in this hotel room on the bed, and there's a nightstand right beside the bed, and you open the door and you pull out, and if there was this guy named Gideon that was there before you, you may pull out a Bible that looks similar to this. And if you open that Bible and you start to read the Hebrew Scriptures and you start to read, you will find there are stories that take place during this time in history. Because these stories, even though God surpasses time and place. These stories in the Bible are placed in. They are still bound to time and place and culture during that time. And in fact, if you take this book that this guy named Gideon left, and you start reading this narrative, and you look through Genesis chapter 12, you will see the story about this dude named Abram, who later becomes Abraham. And if you look at this and you read in Genesis chapter 12, 1 and 2, you'll see this story where this God, our Creator, for the first time in a long time, starts to talk to this dude named Abram. And he says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be blessed." Now, having a God even talk to you was a big deal, because these gods, these forces, were far from us and somewhere else, and they never communicated with us, and we never knew our stance with them. So now Abram hears from this God, and not only does he hear from this God tells him to move from his land and away from his father's house. When we think of father's house, we think of stuff like cable and the garage and the refrigerator with food and the light bill that just happens to magically get paid. But back then, in this time, if your father's house is where you learned how to appease these forces and these gods, and it was unheard of to leave your father's house. Even after your father was gone, it was unheard of. And Abram lived with his father Terah, who worshipped these idols and these gods. And now here's this God speaking to Abram, who later becomes Abraham, and tells him to move away from this place. It's revolutionary. In other words, this God is telling him, I am about to do something new. And if you take this book that Gideon's still left with you and you're still reading through Genesis, you'll find the story in Genesis 15:5, where God is talking to Abraham, and he takes him outside, and it says, Genesis 15:5, it says, "Then he brought him outside and said, look now towards the heaven and count the stars, if you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be." Now, there's a lot of stars. We get this. We understand this. I didn't get this part until this week, and I started studying this and started looking at this. They had, the ancient Sumerians had a god of the stars, and his name was Shemesh. And no doubt, Abram's father, Terah, worshipped Shemesh. So now we have a god, I love this, is using these other gods as props. Which, by the way, I will use the next time someone says, you use a lot of props. Here is a God that uses other gods as props. Now, if you're still stuck in this hotel room, that Gideon was there first, and you keep reading the story, and you're reading the story for the first time, it may seem a little odd, because there is a time in this story where God speaks to Abraham after he has his first child, Isaac, and he tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, which, by the way, in that verse is the first time ever that the word love was mentioned in the Bible. When God says, sacrifice your son who you love. Now, if you're reading this story for the very first time and you've never heard this story before, this may seem odd because, check this out. We got that scripture up there? I'm too far away from my paper. He said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain, and I will show you. Next verse. Early the next morning, Abram got up. Wait a minute. If I'm reading this for the very first time, I'm like, why didn't Abraham say no? Say what? And you're like, oh, he don't question God. He has faith. His faith. Maybe. Part of it, I believe. But see, Abraham grew up in a village and grew up in a town where it was normal for gods to demand the thing that you valued most, and it was normal. Why didn't Abraham say, well, God, I really don't know how to build an altar. I really don't know how to sacrifice a child. None of that. Most likely, Abraham has seen an altar built. Most likely, Abraham has seen a child sacrifice before. And if you're reading the story for the very first time, you're not thinking, Abraham, what a great man, which the scriptures 100% point to Abraham being a great man, but you're thinking, call Child Protective Services right away. Then through this story, God says, Abraham, sacrifice your son. He says, all right. They go to the mountain. He builds the altar. He takes his son, puts him on the altar, takes a knife out, goes to sacrifice him, and then this divine voice says, stop! Abraham says, okay. Now, if the story stopped there, the story would be Abraham, God stopped Abraham, but it didn't stop there, because then God said, don't harm the child. There is a ram in the thicket. No idea what a thicket is, but it's a thick area of stuff. So here, for the very first time, Abraham would have realized that not only am I worshiping a God who blesses me, but now I worship a God who provides, because none of these other gods provided. There is something different about this God. The story is not detached from space and time. That's why he didn't question it. He's seen it happen. This was normal God activity, but then when he provided, well, that wasn't normal God activity. There's something different about this God. So if you're still trapped in this hotel room, that Gideon was there before Pastor Rocky was there, and he's reading this, and he gets to this book called Leviticus. And if he reads through this book of Leviticus, kudos to Pastor Rocky. But in the first 5 chapters, you may read this and say, this is absolutely barbaric, which people have done. But during that time, because the story is still, it does not surpass space and time. It's during this time and during this culture. And now, the Levitical law, for the very first time, it described and wrote out exactly, you do this, well, this is what you do to be right with God. Never before did you know your stance with God. And in the Levitical law, not only do you now know your stance with God, you have a God who is saying, I want to dwell with my people, because all the other gods were far off. We look at Leviticus and we say, man, this is very barbaric. But during that time and during that culture, this story, this Levitical law, would have been revolutionary. And for the very first time, I know I can leave this sacrifice and I know exactly where I stand with God. Then, over time, there was this king. His name was Solomon, and he built this big temple, and that temple wasn't really in the plans, but it got destroyed. And then there was this king named Herod who rebuilt the temple. It was something with 2.2 million stones. Amazing, this temple, what they built. And over time, this Levitical system, the Levitical law, this system that was put into place that now you know you're standing with God, well, it became very political, because there's this group called the Sadducees who now ran this whole process. And see, the Sadducees figured out a way to make lots and lots and lots of money from this system. In fact, they had a lifestyle. They have dug up bottles of wine that would have belonged to Sadducees, that even in this day, if we would have got a bottle of wine like that, it would have cost $5,000 of our money. They lived very well off. And if anybody or anything challenged the system that provided their wealth, well, they had very close ties with the Roman army, and they would make sure that person was stopped. Now, about 2,000 years ago, there was this Jewish rabbi. His name was Jesus. I don't know if you've heard of him. Who walked into this temple, stormed into this temple, and declared and announced, there is something or someone that is greater than this whole process. Something that is greater. And actually in John chapter 2, verse 15, it says that he took and made this whip and started with this whip in the temple and knocking over tables. Now, see, if we wanted to make a revolutionary statement, now what we would do is we would plan a 3-point lecture where all 3 points have the same letter in the alphabet, and you would be like, wow. But back then, in this day, when Jesus, God with skin and bones, walked the earth, well, sermons were told a little different. If you don't believe me, you can look at the other prophets that walked this earth before Jesus did, and when they would tell their stories and they would preach their sermons, well, they wouldn't just speak it, but they would live it. You got the prophet Hosea, who God told him to marry a prostitute just to show, so God could demonstrate. You had the prophet Isaiah that was told to lay on one side for so long, and then was told to only cook his bread with human feces. And Isaiah was like, God, can I use like animal feces instead? And God was like, sure. Whew. Dodged one there. So when Jesus would come in with this whip, he was demonstrating, he was preaching a sermon really when he was turning over these tables. He had this revolutionary idea, and with that driving people out, he was saying this whole sacrificial system that is in place is about to go down. And there is someone greater that is going to take its place. Now, the Sadducees, they didn't really understand what he was talking about, but what they did understand is this is going to take away my money. So they had to put a stop to this rabbi named Jesus. But see, you see in the story of Abraham, you see God pulling them forward through this culture. And then we see through the Levitical law, God pulling us forward through this culture. And then with Jesus, the ultimate pulling us forward through this culture. Constantly going forward. Now, the title of this message, and you're like, wait a minute, you're just now telling me the title of this message? It is 1229. Which you didn't realize it because the message is so good. You're like, it's absolutely funny. I thought you were only speaking for 5 minutes. Maybe not L-Dog. L-Dog probably just thinks that. So, I try to a lot of times figure out like message titles because it does not fail. Somebody throughout the week will ask me, what are you speaking on? And I want to be able to throw out a title and see if it opens the door to a conversation somewhere. And this time it definitely worked because the title of my message is The Gods Must Be Angry. And I had somebody ask me, what are you speaking on? And I said, the gods must be angry. And he said, they're definitely angry at me. I said, God, I got some stuff to do. All right. The door's open. Why do you think the gods are angry at you? Dude, I am exhausted. And this guy starts to tell me this story, and he says, all my life is work, 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 work. And he starts to tell me this story about when he met his wife. And when he met his wife, her parents were very wealthy. And they said, this man will never be able to provide for you. This man will never be able to take care of you. He said, I wanted to prove them wrong. So what I did is I found a house in the same neighborhood where my in-laws lived, and I bought this house that I could not afford. And now I'm trying to keep up with the bills and trying to keep up with this. And I am exhausted. And here we are years later, we have this guy killing himself and bowing down to these gods of success and achievement and ambition and acceptance and validation. Back when I was a youth pastor, there was this teenage girl in my youth group, and she came to me and she said, Pastor Jimmy, I've been cutting myself. And I said, let me see. And she said, no, I'm embarrassed. She goes, my mom is embarrassed of me, and my dad hates me. And I said, your dad don't hate you. And she said, right before I left the church, my dad said, I hate you. And I thought, big time pastor fail. And here we have, thousands of years ago, the prophets of Baal cut themselves to appease the god, Baal. And now we have this teenage girl cutting herself. Why? Because she feels so numb, she just wants to feel something. She wants to feel something. Here we are, we're still bowing down to these same gods and goddesses, but they just of different names. I have a friend who, before I met him, he tried to commit suicide, and he has all these scars on his wrist where he tried to cut himself. And he said, I failed at everything. I couldn't even kill myself. He said, I was so miserable until he met Jesus. And when I met him, he had these tattoos of these crosses that went on his wrists as a sign of, now every time I look at the place that I was so tempted to destroy, I see the redemptive power of Jesus, and I think of what He's done for me. The writer of Hebrews, we have no idea exactly who. We speculation, but who the writer of Hebrews is. But I say whoever she was, she is a genius. You guys don't laugh at nothing. Jeez. And this writer says that Jesus is the culmination of the ages. The culmination of the ages. In other words, He was the ultimate sacrifice that everybody is invited to join. This same friend that I have that cut his wrist and now have crosses on his wrist, I was talking to him. Years ago, I was in a very dark place where I was absolutely miserable, and I just tried to keep myself busy. Because why? Because if I never stopped moving, I never had to deal with the emotions that I was feeling. And I remember talking to him on the phone, and I was telling him all of these things, and my friend just constantly over and over again said, Jimmy, you don't have to live this way. And I said, yeah, I know the sun will come out tomorrow, and tomorrow's another day. He said, no, Jimmy, you don't have to live this way. And I would make excuses, and I would say this, and I wasn't really listening. And he said it about 20 times before I stopped, and I just listened. And I realized I don't have to bow down to these gods. I don't have to live this way. 5 years ago, my sister Chrissy came up with this idea on October 10th. It's my mom's birthday, that we would meet together, my two sisters and I, and we'd go to different places, and we would get together on my mom's birthday, which is October 10th, and we would just celebrate our mother. This last week we got together. It was the sixth time. It's the one picture in the middle. We got together at Cobb's Landing, and we sat there, and my mom has been gone for 18 years. It's crazy because there's times where it just seems like yesterday. There's times where I still think, I'm just going to pick up the phone and call Mom. And then it hits me, I can't. You'd think that would stop after 18 years. But we got together this past week at Cobb's Landing and was eating. And then there was at a point where I just stopped eating, and I looked at my sisters and I said, it just feels like Mom is here. And no longer, my whole perspective changed. And no longer was I so focused on one day. On the one day. It doesn't do me any good when I want my mom to meet her grandson or granddaughter. that one day doesn't help me at all when I want my mom to meet this blonde chick I met who loves me the way that my mom said I always deserve to be loved. But at that moment, my perspective started to change, and I thought, you know what? The miracle that never happened, that we thought never happened, maybe we were just looking at the wrong miracle. Because maybe the miracle was not her healing, but it is that 18 years after her death, her children can get together and talk about her and the things that she taught us and can hand them down from generation to generation to generation. 18 years after her death. And I got in my truck that night after we got done eating, and I said, yes, Mom. Once again, you're right. Those two girls that I complained about and aggravated me, and I would say, I wish I was the only child. Yes, they did become two of my best friends. Maybe that's the miracle. Paul tells us, he says, through Jesus' bloodshed on the cross, God has reconciled himself to all things. Now, I looked it up, what all things mean in Greek, and it means all things. Reconciled himself to all things. And the Christians, the early Christians of that day, you know what they called this? The good news. They called it the good news. Why? Because it's about restoration. It's about he restored us. Hebrews 10, 11 and 14 says, day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties again and again. He offered the same sacrifice, which can never take away sins. If I was in that day, I would have said, now you tell me. But when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sin, he sat down at the right hand of God, and since that time he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool. For by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. In Romans, Paul tells us to offer ourselves up as living sacrifices. Hebrews 13, 15, and 16, it says, through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of our lips, openly profess his name, and do not forget to do good. I think sometimes we forget that part, right? Yeah. Forget to do good and to share with ourselves, to share with our family. No, to share with others, for with such sacrifices, God is pleased. Paul says we're to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. And I found when you do this, your heart just opens up. And when you put flesh and blood on the reconciliation of all things, and you act it out as a living, breathing sacrifice, that's when you usher in the kingdom of God. There's this woman that I was told about. She has 4 kids, and her husband came to her and told her about his girlfriend. They were working through that, and another day he came to her and said, I'm going to leave you for my girlfriend. And that's what he did. And now this woman is a single mother with 4 young kids, and she is about to lose her apartment. And she was going to this church, and this couple found out in this church what was going on, and they invited the woman and her kids out for lunch after church. And when they did, they went into this one neighborhood, and she was like, what are we doing here? Like, where are we going? This isn't where the restaurant is. And they pulled into this driveway up to this house, and they handed this mom the keys and said, we just bought this house for you. Would you like a tour? My granddaddy and my parents, my grandparents and my parents, they owned this carpet shop for years through almost my entire childhood. And there's a story, and not many people know about it. I shared it with my dad the other day, and I don't even think he knew about it. But there was this time, this carpet installer was getting very mad at my grandfather. I don't know what it was about, but the door was cracked, and I could see through this cracked door. And I visually saw this carpet installer spit in my grandfather's face. Now, you got to understand, my grandfather would do anything for anybody. There was times where my grandparents, they would give somebody their paycheck and eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for the week. And I saw this man spit in my grandfather's face, and I thought to myself, I will kill him. He no longer worked at the store, but 2 weeks later, this carpet installer that spit in my grandfather's face, 2 weeks later, his family had no food. My grandfather and my grandmother went to a grocery store. Wow. They bought groceries. They took it to this man's house that spit in his face. And when somebody asked him, why would you do that? His response was, we all have bad days. Dave Rover, I had the privilege of meeting this man. He was a war veteran in Vietnam. He fell on a grenade, and it blew up half his face. And he now goes around speaking. And when I was a teenager, I had the privilege of hearing him speak in Waimama, Florida, and telling his story. And he tells the story of where he was in the hospital room, and half his face was blown off, and he had just got married, and all he thought is, when my wife sees me, she is going to leave me. He said he was so nervous. He said he thought about killing himself because he thought, I have nothing to live for. His wife, they hadn't even been married a year. His wife walks in. Her name was Brenda Rover. She walks in, and he thought, she is going to turn around and walk away. She walks in, and he tells the story. He says, she looks at me, and he says, I know I am ugly. And her response was, you never look that good anyways. And she kissed him and said, let's go home. There's this surgeon, his name's Richard Selzer, and he's a surgeon. He writes about these experiences that he has seen. And he said there was this one woman, she had this tumor in her cheek, and he had to go in and he had to remove over half of her face, and he had to cut this nerve that now her smile, she had this crooked smile, and that the husband was in the room as they unwrapped his wife's face. And she looked in the mirror and she asked the surgeon, will my smile will always be like this? And he says, unfortunately, it will. And he says that moment, her husband made his lips in a crooked way to match her lips and kissed her on the lips and said, I like it. Brendan Manning is a writer, and he tells this story about this Catholic woman who lived in the West, and she was having these visions of Jesus. Lord forbid, right? And they thought she was crazy, and nobody believed her. And the Archbishop met with her, and he tried to convince her, you are not really having visions of Jesus. It's just all in your head. She goes, yeah, I really think it's Jesus. And he goes, okay, I tell you what. Next time you have this vision, ask Jesus what I confessed at my last confessional. The woman says, okay, I will. Some time passed. He hadn't heard anything from this woman, but he heard throughout the village that she had continued to have these visions of Jesus. So he went to her and he said, I hear you're having these visions. Did you have these visions of Jesus again? And she said, yes, I continue to have these visions. He said, did you remember to ask him what I confessed at the last confessional? And she took the Archbishop by the hand. And she said, he said, exactly. I don't remember. And she took the bishop's hand. And her response to what Jesus said, to what his last confessional was, she took him by the hand and he said exactly, I don't remember. And the husband bent down and kissed her crooked mouth and said, I like it. And his wife said to him, you weren't that good looking anyways. And kissed him and said, let's go home. And when my granddaddy was asked, why did you do this for this man that spit in your face? He said, everybody has bad days. And that girl who cut herself, well, I had the privilege and the honor to look her in the eye and say, I'm not embarrassed of you, and neither is Jesus. And the couple said to the single mom, here's the keys to your house. Would you like a tour? And I stopped eating and looked at my sisters and said, it feels like Mom is here. And my friend on the other line repeated, Jimmy, you don't have to live like this. You don't have to live like this. I just feel like somebody needs to hear this. You don't have to live like this. You don't have to bow to these gods of money, of acceptance, of success. You don't have to live like this. My best friends, may you come to see that He has appeared at the culmination of the ages. And may you come to trust that the reconciliation has been made. And may you believe that this God, the God we serve, He is not angry with you. For this God, the God we serve, well, this God is love.
Yes.